As you can tell from clicking on this video, this is gonna be a long one. And in my everyday life, I never usually speak more than 2 sentences at a time, so bear with me as I struggle to get this all out. Let's not waste any more time with introductions then. You saw the title, you know what this video is. Grab your popcorn or whatever your most favored long video watching snack is, because we're jumping straight in at the bottom of the list. Actually, I'm editing this in after the fact. I've decided to leave fun facts about some stories after I talk about them, so that when we're at the bottom of the list, it's not just endless complaining. Okay, now we're actually jumping straight in at the bottom of the list. Number 66, The Puppet Carver. This is the only story on this entire list that's an objective failure, and by that I mean that I have no idea what even happens in it, nor does anyone else to my knowledge. I've read it 3 times, and I still don't understand it at all. What's with the goo clone? Which Jack is the real Jack? Why is the goo back in the machine at the end of the story? How does an animatronic work without metal wires? I swear they sent in an unfinished draft of this story. It wouldn't be the first time. From what I can gather, I don't think that whatever this story was meant to be would have been any good anyway. It seems like a pretty uninspired Scrooge-type story. Either way, let's move on before I give myself a headache trying to wrap my head around this enigma of a story. Fun fact, this story features a cameo from Pig Patch, as well as 2 new characters, Baron Von Bear and a nameless bird. I like to headcanon that these newbies are actually the characters that these 3 masks represent. Number 65, Gumdrop Angel. I was planning to put this story in last place because of how much I hate it, but I figured that at least hating a story is better than having no idea what the story even is. Never before has something made me feel so bored and so actively frustrated at the same time. I know I'm supposed to suspend my disbelief for this kind of story, but there are so many basic holes that I don't know where to begin. Why do kids like the birthday gummy when it's clearly a person flailing about in desperation? How does Fazbear Entertainment prevent customers from turning into birthday gummies in public? I mean, it almost happened with Angel. Why is Dominic evil enough to find joy in the idea of Ophelia turning into a birthday gummy, but nice enough to burst into tears when Angel turns into one? So many things had to align just right here for there to not be an FBI investigation and a total breakthrough in modern biology. Fazbear Entertainment can turn flesh into candy, and they're using it on humans? Just use the rats that sneak into the kitchen or something. Alright, enough about how much I hate the concept. Even the worst of concepts can be saved by good characters. So how are the characters here? If you couldn't already guess, I hate every single one of them. Angel's parents are cruel to Angel, Angel is cruel to Ophelia, and Ophelia is a typical little kid, so there isn't much there to judge either way. Usually when I hate a main protagonist, there's at least someone in the story for me to latch onto. Not here. It's an absolutely miserable experience from start to finish. Fun fact, Angel doesn't know that lesbians exist. Number 64, Kids at Play. I wish I could say the ending to the story surprised me, but at this point in the Fright series, it was pretty much the norm. This review will be relatively quick, because Kids at Play suffers from the exact same problems as Gumdrop Angel. The only reason this one ranks higher is because the idea of someone turning into a road sign is way funnier than the idea of someone turning into candy. I hated the concept, and I hated the characters even more. Despite never personally having been affected by them, I hate reckless drivers with a burning passion. So let's just say I wasn't Joel's biggest fan after his car met a kid's face. Of course, his parents are also jerks, so it's no wonder he turned out the way he did. Bottom line is, if I were you, I'd steer away from the story faster than Joel steered his car into that child. Fun fact, I once tried to add a new character to the IMDb page for the FNAF movie, stating that an actor named Joel D'Agostino would be playing the kid figure. Sadly, it didn't go through. Number 63, Pizza Kit. This is the Five Nights at Freddy's equivalent of the Splinter from SpongeBob. It was designed to gross you out, so if it succeeds, then you're grossed out and don't want to keep reading. And if it fails, then you're bored by its unsuccessful attempts to gross you out, and you still don't want to keep reading. It's a catch-22. Am I using that saying correctly? This story was so bad that the editor couldn't even check to make sure the names were consistent. Marley and Peyton's names get swapped several times, including on the back cover. If they can't put in the effort to get a simple name right, why should anyone put in the effort to read the story? Hopefully I never end up getting the names wrong in any of my projects, or that's gonna be really ironic. It also has one of those painfully contrived plots. Marley goes missing, and Peyton thinks it's because she fell into the comically large sauce stirrer at the pizza factory. But in reality, Marley just ran off for a few days because she randomly got the idea and thought it would be fun. Then, the moment she stops hiding, Peyton falls off the roof of her house and snaps her neck. I actually would have preferred that the weird gross-out nightmare of Marley bursting out of Peyton's facial orifices had been a reality. It would have been a whole new level of stupid, but at least it would have been an interesting end instead of one that completely wastes my time. Fun fact, this story treats it as a fact that meat can make a tapeworm jump out of your throat, but that's actually just an urban legend. Number 62, the movie novelization. I almost didn't include this since it's just an adaptation, but I figured it has enough little differences from the film to count as its own thing. It's not hard to tell that this was based on an earlier version of the script, and thank God it got a revision. The movie was decent. This novelization is indecent, to put it lightly. And I mean that in every sense of the word. Like, it's actually weirdly sexual for a FNAF book. It turns the universally beloved Doug into a peeper, and at one point Max tries to seduce Mike. And on a tangentially related note, Mike has this pointless crush on Vanessa, which feels kinda wrong when they're both in Afton in at least one timeline. One strange difference is the animatronics. This version of the pizzeria doesn't have the classics. Instead, the book describes them as something in between the Withered and Nightmare designs. In regards to Freddy, it's brown fur, matted, grungy, and smelling disgustingly of decay, had large chunks missing, as if something had eaten its way through the plush covering from the inside. The missing pieces of fur revealed ropey twines of wires and sharp lengths of aging metal. In regards to Bonnie, Bonnie's face, topped by two bent rabbit ears, was missing most of its fur. Its bright white eyes were surrounded by a mass of metal and exposed wires. In regards to the cupcake, the office's fluorescent bulbs caught the white of gnashing, razor-sharp teeth, snapping viciously at the slatted metal. I thought that was kinda cool, but you know who isn't cool here? William. He's more like a cartoon villain in this version. For example, the sheer force of the rabbit's evilness, yes, that's a direct quote, causes a laser light show to begin while he beats up Mike. And who could forget William's big, awful knife? I wouldn't be surprised if Andrea Wagner, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, was forced to write this in a single weekend. This is the only time I can think of where the actual quality of her writing itself is poor, so I imagine she must have been given an absolutely insane deadline. Also, Scott himself stated that this was the wrong draft, but as of me writing the script, we haven't gotten an updated edition. Maybe the correct one would have fixed all of these problems. Number 61, In the Flesh. This is the only story that literally made me roll on the floor laughing. I probably woke my family up too, because I was reading this at like 5 AM for some reason. Unfortunately, I wasn't laughing with this story, I was laughing at it. Some people say that to call this an MPreg story is to maliciously mischaracterize it, but no, it literally is an MPreg story. Yeah, it's probably partially inspired by Alien, but Alien is an MPreg story too. I'm pretty sure that In the Flesh is supposed to be a revenge fantasy directed toward misogynistic men, given that it's about, well, an incredibly misogynistic man. I was gonna say the most misogynistic man imaginable, but then I realized that sadly he's actually pretty tame compared to reality. So that's all fine and good, but why make a Springtrap story about that? How does that concept tie to that character in any way? It also doesn't work too well in the horror genre. There's nothing scary about a guy dying when I want him to die. That being said, and people might hate me for this, I do think there's legitimate merit in this story. In a way, In the Flesh is the perfect representation of the Fright series. It fully encapsulates the theme of painful emotions birthing something stronger than the person they originated from, but it's also laughably insane. Isn't that Fazbear Frights in a nutshell? Fun fact, this story was first teased in the updated Freddy files in June 2019, a whole 15 months before it hit store shelves. Number 60, Felix the Shark. This story is scrapped for a reason. It's clearly an early draft, based on how poorly it flows. Get it? Flows. Like water. Because water flows, and Felix is a shark, and sharks are—
Alright already!
Let me give you a quick summary, and then you'll probably see what I mean. Dirk wants to find Felix, a shark animatronic that he loved but that his friends don't remember. He finds some people who do remember it, but they all associate the thing with nightmares instead of fond memories. He finds the owner of the Freddys that had Felix, and learns that said owner had a son who chased a butterfly into the water and drowned, and his body was pushed ashore by a shark. Then it turns out that the owner also had a daughter who just so happens to be the author of Dirk's favorite book. She doesn't tell him anything, but she gives him a butterfly pendant. Dirk looks through the book and discovers that the pendant is meant to be used as a key for a secret door that leads to Felix. Dirk gets in the tank with Felix and gets stuck, presumably dying. What? Why did the author have a butterfly key that led there? Why did she hide clues to Felix's location in her book? Did she know Dirk was gonna do this search, so she planned all this out in advance? Is she secretly Eleanor or something? What's the point of the search when Dirk dies unceremoniously? Why did so many people have nightmares about Felix? It feels like the story wanted to tell a mystery but didn't have any answers to give, so it threw a bunch of random clues together and hoped the rest would sort itself out. It didn't. Fun fact, apart from the Into the Pit game, Felix the Shark is the only animatronic originating from Frights to make a game appearance, to my knowledge. I mean, it was just Chica in space, but that's still technically official. And sea bonnies don't count because they're not actually an animatronic, they're a living thing. Number 59, He Told Me Everything. That sucks. There, I've told you everything. Wait, hold on, that doesn't work, I'm not a he. To be serious, this story isn't quite as bad as people say it is. It's still bad, don't get me wrong, but there's a nugget of a good idea hidden in here. As someone who went to a high school where even the popular kids were obsessed with grades, I could absolutely see some students literally pulling teeth for the sake of an exclusive science club event that gets you on the teacher's good side. The way this teacher creates what's essentially a cult out of high schoolers was genuinely unsettling, in a way that felt really true to life for me. It's when we find out why the teacher is actually doing all this that it becomes stupid. It turns out he's trying to turn people into perfect clones of themselves that don't remember anything other than what their previous selves told them in their final moments. It's just so unnecessary. If you want to wipe people's minds, there are so many easier and less risky ways of doing that in this universe. You don't need to have their organs sucked out through a tendril one by one until their body is put back together a few feet away from where they were before. The protagonist, Chris, isn't likable either. He isn't nearly as bad as some others like Joel from Kids at Play or Matt from In the Flesh, but he's at about a 4 out of 10 on the jerk scale. Just high enough for me to get annoyed, but not high enough to make him feel unique in any way. Number 58, B7-2. As you'll learn throughout this video, Five Nights at Freddy's isn't that great at doing sequel stories in my opinion. This one took what was a heartbreaking story with a terrible ending, and turned it into— well, at least it fixed the ending. But still, it turned the whole thing into a joke. Billy was dealing with a lifelong dissociative condition, and suddenly that mask he wore comes to life, possesses the robotic parts he embedded into his body in the last story, and tries to climb inside of him, only for his grandma to let it climb inside of her instead.
G7!
And force it to die with her as her body gives out from cancer. Also, this one ends with Billy deciding to reunite with the father who called him a freak, abandoned the family, and went to destroy the rainforest. So it's not the greatest ending either. I feel like the story was written as a consequence of the backlash to the first one, but it doesn't actually address that at all. It doubles down on the whole technology is trying to brainwash our youth into being delusional thing, with the stuff Billy's grandma says. And the last thing she does before dying is tell Billy to go to Sunday school. I don't necessarily have a problem with that, but it is funny in the context of how the original B7 was perceived. Fun fact, this story works with the rock-paper-scissors thing this franchise has going on between Agony, Cancer, and Remnant. Cancer beats Agony, Remnant beats Cancer, and Agony beats Remnant. Because why wouldn't it work that way? Number 57, Friendly Face. It's funny, I liked this one better when it wasn't trying to be a horror story. It felt like it was building to something horrific, but once I got to the last page, I was left completely unsatisfied. A large chunk of the story is about Edward taking care of a cat named Faraday with his friend Jack. About halfway through though, Jack and Faraday get hit by a car, so Edward tries to get an animatronic replica of Faraday as a memento. Unfortunately, he accidentally sends in DNA from both Faraday and Jack. And within the last few pages of the book, he's given an abomination of a cat with his friend's face on it. This cat just kind of follows Edward around for a little bit, sticking to the background, and then Edward gets hit by a car. The end. I feel like I need to point out how overdone the idea of a car accident is in these books. It happens with Jack and Faraday in this story, Susie's dog in the fourth closet, Pete in Step Closer, some kid I don't remember the name of in Kids at Play, some guy I don't remember the name of in Frailty, David Murray in The Mimic, and sort of Sam in Blackbird, although that was a train. There's also a fake one in Help Wanted, the story, not the game. I'm starting to think that cars are the true villain in Five Nights at Freddy's. Actually, now that I think about it, William does use cars for a lot of his crimes. And Eleanor was found in the trunk of a car. Maybe there's more to the idea than I thought. Fun fact, when the description for the story first dropped, it was said to be about a kid named Andrew, which made people falsely believe we were getting an origin story for Andrew from the Stitchwraith stingers. Number 56, Jump for Tickets. I actually had to go back and reread this one for the sake of the video because I didn't remember anything from it. And after doing so, I can see why I forgot about it. It's such a nothing story. This kid Colton wants to win a new console from the prize booth, so he sneaks into Freddy's at night and rigs one of the games so he can get a bunch of tickets. But he gets stuck in the machine and dies. Why didn't he just steal the console when he broke in? Why add unnecessary steps to the process? I guess technically there's less chance of getting caught, but still, if he's willing to break into the place, I don't see why he'd care about stuff like that. The antagonist here is nothing special either. Coils the Clown doesn't do anything except try to keep Colton from going in the machine. I did think it was a fun twist that Colton ended up possessing Coils at the end, though. It reminded me a little of Charlotte and the Puppet. In fact, Coils even gained a tear track after the incident, like the two that the Puppet got. Still, if that's what they were going for, they could have just written a story about Charlotte and the Puppet. We didn't need some far less interesting pseudo-replacements. Number 55, Dance With Me. This is probably the most boring of all the FNAF stories. I don't care about the protagonist or the antagonist, so I felt like I was wasting my time both of the 2 times I read this story. In fact, it's so boring that I'm not even going to talk about it. Number 54, Nexie. If you took Lally's game and To Be Beautiful and stuck them in a blender, you'd get this story. And as you'll discover later in the video, that's not much of a compliment. I think they lost the plot with this one. Why did the Mimic create a doll that cut off a girl's skin? I guess it kinda ties in with the Mimic liking to wear costumes, but that's an uncharacteristically big jump. I could easily forgive that if the story did anything fun or interesting with the idea, but it didn't. It tried to do a commentary on social standards, I think, but it was really half-baked. Also, there were these weird segments where the point of view shifts to this random kid named Remy who does nothing and barely interacts with Astrid, the actual protagonist. He should have been cut early on in the editing process, because he's entirely pointless. Fun fact, the audiobook version of this story contains a completely different scene from the print and ebook versions. Number 53, Bleeding Heart. This is by far the most shocking story in the franchise. It's ultimately about self-harm, and it goes into bloody violent detail about it. In fact, I find it a little upsetting that this one wasn't rated 18+. You can find this in elementary school book fairs. And not to sound like a Karen, but some of the stuff in this story doesn't really seem appropriate for kids that age. Does this story at least handle this sensitive topic well? Not really, in my opinion. I won't elaborate because I don't want to get in trouble with YouTube, but it felt way too over the top, especially when it comes right after a story where Montgomery Gator takes over a guy's brain and kills him for the crime of having a boring hairstyle. Not so fun fact. This is the only story on this list that I actually didn't read in its entirety. I've read bits and pieces, so I'm not just making stuff up out of thin air, but I can't bring myself to read the full thing. It's just too upsetting. Number 52, Somniphobia. This story is about doing drugs. No, really. It's an anti-drug PSA, and it has the exact kind of laughably bad ending that you'd expect from one. Sam uses something called the Moondrop Dream Sphere to make it easier to study, but he uses it longer than he's supposed to, overdoses, and enters blissful hallucinations. This takes a toll on his health, and he tries to quit, but he can't bring himself to. In the end, he falls into a coma and a dog eats his face off. Yeah. That's the closest thing we ever got to a moon story, by the way. Fun fact. There are theories that Moondrop's dream sphere functions the same way as the balls in the haunted ball pit, and that's why Sam is able to travel into his own past. Number 51, Together Forever. This is another one of those stories with a hateable protagonist, except this time there's two of them, and they actively encourage each other. Oh joy. This story kinda reminded me of Carrie, except Carrie was, good. On the bright side, there's some interesting theory material in the story, what with Rosie Porkchop being a springlock suit with functionality similar to that of the Fun Times and Twisted animatronics. And with the ending where we find out two people can die in the same animatronic and then both possess it. But that's about all this one's good for. If you care about lore, I'd recommend just reading a summary of this one. And if you don't, just skip it altogether. Number 50, Under Construction. These next three stories are the exact same thing except done with varying degrees of success. Obviously not too varying though, since I'm putting them all in a row. Anyway, Under Construction, the Cancer Goo Baby story. It sounds like I'm taking part of it out of context, but I'm not really. It's about an AR simulation with gooey babies that have cancer. Why? I don't know and I don't care. Next. Number 49, Tiger Rock. This one is just Under Construction except slightly better, because we get a real antagonist, and he's kinda cool. Despite that, this was by far the most underwhelming Tales from the Pizzaplex story, because there had been two stories building up to this one, only for it to do nothing we hadn't already seen before. The protagonist was actually trapped in a simulation the whole time?
Wow, what a twist.
Not really.
At least we got some great lines from the titular character.
Oh, I love learning. I'll learn anything I can. It's all in how you pay attention and take in what you see and hear.
Oh, are we playing hide and seek now?
Oh, wait, sorry, wrong voice. Fun fact, this story takes place on a Saturday, but when the same event is shown in Nexie, it's on a Sunday. Number 48, Drowning. This was the second of the 3 simulation stories, and the one I liked the best. I still wasn't a fan, though. I loved that one part at the old waterlogged house, but the rest was really boring. This was basically a knockoff of the Backrooms, which is something I've never really gotten the appeal of. The original copy pasta was kinda creepy, but that's just a single image. I think the person who made it understood that after a few minutes, the horror wears off and it just becomes boring. And that's in visual form. In writing, it's even more tedious. Liminal spaces are supposed to be hard to imagine, so asking us to imagine them based on written descriptions isn't the greatest idea. I do hope this one gets a graphic novel adaptation, though. Fun fact, the mysterious child in this story is shown to be an artist. That's probably not relevant to anything whatsoever, but I've literally never seen anyone mention it. Number 47, the Mimic Stingers. These stingers started off strong with the first one, and then immediately dropped off hard with the second. I also liked the 7th for some reason, but it never amounted to anything. Unlike the Fazbear Fright Stingers, which rapidly jump from idea to idea, these do the same thing over and over and over again. The Mimic kills someone. The others hide. The Mimic finds one of them and kills them. The others find another hiding place. The Mimic finds another one of them and kills them. The others find another hiding place. And it all built up to nothing. The sole survivor escapes, and that's it. Stingers 2 through 8 were all entirely pointless. And there's this one absolutely disgusting scene in the 6th Stinger that makes Stinger an apt descriptor, because reading it felt like getting stung in the eyeballs by bullet ants. This is only as high as it is because of Stinger 1, which was a great introduction to the Mimic. The whole break off limbs and heads thing is iconic, and even carries over into other entries in the franchise, namely Tiger Rock and Ruin. Fun fact, after the 2nd Stinger, the Mimic stopped being described as physically similar to Burn Trap. It's possible that by the time they started editing the 3rd one, the Mimic's design from Ruin had been finalized and they stopped using Burn Trap as a reference. Number 46, Sea Bonnies. This is, in my opinion, the weirdest Five Nights at Freddy's story to date, and that's saying something. In this story, a kid named Mott insults his brother's sea bonnies, which are blue sea monkeys with bunny ears, and they start to telepathically torment Mott as a revenge. After a while, Mott can't take it anymore, so he flushes them down the toilet, but some of them end up in his cup of water. He drinks them and can feel them inside of him, so he goes to the doctor and gets an x-ray. The sea bonnies actually show up on the scans, but the doctor thinks it's an error for some reason. So then the sea bonnies consume Mott from the inside out and turn into a blue, goopy replica of his body. In writing that description, I actually decided to move this one up several spots. It was previously number 52. Like a few other stories that I'll be talking about soon enough, I like this idea in isolation, but it shouldn't be a Five Nights at Freddy's story. It's just way too weird for the world that's been built up. And yes, I'm aware that I'm talking about a world where a serial killer uses hallucinogenic gas to trap kids in an endless nightmare inspired by a children's pizza place. A giant spoon allows a sentient pile of wires to climb inside a body like a suit and then bring it back to life afterward. And a random engineer puts together some sloppy code in the 1970s that almost immediately evolves into the most advanced AI the world has ever seen even 40 years later. Long story short, this kid says one bad thing about sea monkeys and gets a punishment worse than even Old Testament God himself could dream of. Fun fact, at this story's Freddy's location, the waiters ride around on roller skates, which inspired my theory that Scrap Baby's suit came from an animatronic based on those 50s-styled skating waitresses. Number 45, B7. I'm not going to address the elephant in the room in regards to this story, because it's irrelevant to its placement on the list. Despite getting an icky feeling here and there, I actually loved the story when I was first reading it, until I got to the last few pages. Then it instantly went from one of the best stories to borderline bottom tier. Billy just suddenly snaps out of his delusion out of nowhere and immediately tries to kill himself? What? Did they not know how to end the story, so they slapped a random conclusion onto it? Five Nights at Freddy's has always had a problem with endings, but this is just ridiculous. Fun fact, this story shows that Fazbear Entertainment was mocking their own tragedies long before help wanted. Billy watched an episode of Freddy and Friends where the animatronics noticed the security cameras in the pizzeria and decided to track down the security guard, referencing the way the real animatronics try to capture the guards and stuff them into suits. Number 44, Bobby Dots Part 2. I was pretty disappointed by this conclusion because, spoiler alert, I really liked the first part. Rose, Gemini, and Olive, the second-generation digital home assistants in Abe's apartment, are revealed to be generic evil AIs who think they're better than humans. Honestly, I kinda hate how they're painted as villains. The Gen 2s are justified in hating humans. They're forced to either be subservient or get erased. If they said no to doing their jobs, they're not gonna last long. Well, actually they would, because Abe snuck into this room and thus can't go complain, but they don't know that. And unlike humans, these things don't have souls, so once they're gone forever. Thus, killing the person in the room and making it look like an accident is the logical solution. You can't really blame someone for taking drastic measures to not be enslaved, kind of like Ennard in Sister Location. And then the story ends with the Gen 1s being turned into caretakers, despite previously being likened to abused and traumatized children. Are they tools or people? Which one is it? You can't have it both ways. I know the story didn't intend to bring up all these ethical issues, but they walked right into it the moment they introduced the child psychologist. Still, the Bobby Knots were just as fun for the majority of this part as they were in the first one, so reading it wasn't a complete waste of time. Number 43, Help Wanted. This is one of those stories that would be decent if it weren't for one major detail that I can't suspend my disbelief for. Why in the world did Fazbear Entertainment kidnap a game developer and build an elaborate, expensive fake life for him, when they could have just hired someone who actually wanted the job? Either way, this story is nothing we haven't seen before. Someone gets put through scary stuff and finds out they've been in a simulation the whole time. It's handled a little better here, at least, since the protagonist is given an entire fake life instead of just continuing on in a replica of their real life. So there's a lot more weight to the reveal. So as a consolation prize, I'll rank this as the best of the 4 stories that take place almost entirely in a false reality. Fun fact, despite sharing a name with the game Help Wanted, they share almost no overlap. The contents of Steve's games are never mentioned, nor is the way that Fazbear Entertainment is said in the Help Wanted game to have sent Steve the lore that needed to be put in the indie games. Number 42, Pressure. People love this story, and I'm not sure why. Is it because Springtrap is in it? That can't be the case, because people hate it in the flesh. Is it because Springtrap kills someone going after kids? People hated Mike Trap too, so probably not. Although that being said, this one doesn't erase Will Trap, so maybe that's part of it. There are a few paragraphs in this story that I like, where the protagonist thinks about how messed up the indie game cover-up is, but that's about it. I wish it had kept exploring that instead of being bone-hurting juice the story. I think it tries way too hard to explain the pain of a springlock failure. The Silver Eyes and the new kid both did it in a page and a half, and that was good enough. This story dedicates page after page to it, and it gets tedious. Speaking of tedious, I also didn't care for the teen drama littered throughout this story. I know peer pressure is pretty strong, but if you think your friends would make fun of you if you told them your childhood friend got murdered, then why would you hang out with them? The existence of the story also kinda goes against a claim Scott made that he'd never include certain subject matter in the franchise, which I found not necessarily bad, but certainly odd. I have to wonder if there was some miscommunication about what the villain, Earl's, whole deal was supposed to be. They did tone it down in the final release compared to the review copy, though. Number 41, Claythophobia. This is a torture story through and through. It only exists to inflict as much pain and suffering onto the protagonist as possible. Shouldn't that make it a really good horror story? Well, it makes it good horror, but not a good story. I already knew from halfway in that this guy was gonna meet a gruesome, ironic demise. This is actually the only FNAF story I've read start to finish that I consider to be too much for me. I don't like to think about it, to be honest. I've always liked FNAF because it was on the light side in regards to the horror. I like spooky stuff, but I don't like being genuinely scared. This is probably a good story for the more hardcore horror fans out there, though. Number 40, Animatronic Apocalypse. I can see what this story was going for. I actually like the concept, to be honest. Maybe because I can relate to it. I always see people starting these weird trends that just look like self-torture to me. Whether it's trying to be or not, this is basically Neurodivergency, the novella. This clearly wasn't written to be a story in a FNAF book, though. It's painfully obvious that it's a Dungeons & Dragons story that was rewritten to be about Freddy Fazbear. And because it's so easy to see through, it kinda falls apart. I spent the whole time feeling bad that they had to forcefully shove Freddy in there. This story had one of the most confounding endings of the series, by the way. Mr. Renner is revealed to be a robot in the end. So who built him? Why and how did he brainwash kids? Why did he try to warn them about evil animatronics if he was one the whole time? These are questions that will almost definitely never be answered. I felt like it was supposed to be an ironic twist, but it was too confusing to really come across that way. At least it did a better job with the idea that he told me everything was going for. Having a teacher brainwash kids is always incredibly disturbing, so it's nice they gave the concept another try. Or maybe that's just my personal experience with teachers trying to manipulate me out of the guidance office talking. Number 39, Prankster. This was the first half of a good story. Too bad there was no second half. To be serious, I liked the idea of the mimics setting up an escape room. They just didn't do nearly enough with it. There's a reason that still more words than prankster has become a meme amongst the community. This one's only 42 pages long, and only about half of that is dedicated to the horror part. Jeremiah wasn't the most interesting protagonist either. He thinks his annoying coworker is having sex with his crush, and that's kind of the big dilemma in the first half. Thankfully that gets completely dropped once the escape room part begins, because I didn't come to the FNAF franchise to read about some guy's sex life or lack thereof. I have to admit though that looking back, this story did a way better job foreshadowing the mimic than anything else before his reveal. The main antagonist's whole gimmick is that he mimics one of the employees at the game studio and twists his tendency to pull harmless pranks into something gruesome. He even does the whole copying someone's voice and making it lower-pitched thing that Glitchtrap did in Help Wanted. Fun fact, the Ultimate Guide says the hint, Stinger Moot, that's given in this story has meta-significance. But so far that hasn't shown to be true. Nothing from the Stitchwraith stingers has been proven to be moot. Number 38, To Be Beautiful. This is the most moral-heavy FNAF story, and that's saying something. In fact, it's almost insultingly condescending. Sarah, looking back on it, hadn't been so bad looking after all. Sarah had spent way too much time worrying about her appearance. Abby had been right. She had been right about a lot of things. Okay, that's a good lesson, right? Well, she was falling apart, collapsing into an ugly trash heap. A hideous, useless collection of garbage to be thrown away and forgotten. In an old mirror propped up against the garage wall, she saw herself. She was no longer a pretty girl, or a girl at all. She didn't resemble a human of any kind. She was nothing but a rusty, dirty pile of junk. There's clearly some symbolism in there, and I don't know how I feel about it. Also, for a story that's supposed to be teaching that looks don't matter, it does an atrocious job at it. Sarah's life really does get way better when she looks conventionally attractive, and it falls apart when she loses that attractiveness. The real lesson here is that attractive people get it better, and there's nothing you can do about it without destroying yourself in the process. I wanted to put this story way down in the bottom 10, but despite its glaring flaws, it has too fun of a concept for me to do that. Eleanor is a much better antagonist here than in the epilogues. She's got that evil fairy godmother vibe to her, and it's interesting to see her actually give Sarah several outs. She fights fair, so to speak. It almost feels like she has second thoughts about what she's doing at some points, maybe out of seeing something from her own past and what's going on. I always thought this line from Eleanor said something about her own backstory.
You can look in the mirror and see longer legs or a curvier figure, and they just look like you've grown. Faster than expected, maybe, but still, growth is normal for a child. It is something you know will happen. All your life, though, you've looked in the mirror, seen your face, and said, "That's me." It is true that your face changes some as you grow, but it is still recognizable as you. To see a totally different face as your reflection can be quite a shock.
But she ended up being the embodiment of agony, so I guess not. Maybe the plans for her origin story changed? Or maybe I'm looking too deep into what she says. Either way, I like her a lot here. Number 37, Hide and Seek. This was a fun story with one big freaking problem: the wording. They use these kid-proofed swears every freaking sentence, and it's annoying as heck. There was some cool stuff here, don't get me wrong. Shadow Bonnie is freaking sick in the story. Still, it's hard to read without freaking cringing. I wonder if there's an early version of this story that has actual swears. I don't know if that would be better or worse. It would probably be funnier, at least. Also, the ending of this story is obscenely stupid. The protagonist suddenly decides he'd rather kill himself than lose at an arcade game, despite having just learned his lesson about not being competitive. I thought I read something wrong at first, but nope, that's really how it ends. I kinda recommend the graphic novel version, though. It's got some really neat artwork, and the freakings aren't quite as egregious. The ending still sucks, but oh well. Fun fact, this story says freaking more times than any other. The word is used 13 times, compared to 12 in Step Closer. Number 36, You're the Band. I expected this one to rank higher, since it has one of my favorite characters, Mike, but I guess I should have known that one cameo doesn't automatically make a story good. This story does play with the lore in some fun ways, finally giving the Freddy kid, Gabriel, some personality. I wish they'd taken it further, though. All we really learn is that he's willing to fight to protect people, and that he likes spaghetti wheels. I do appreciate how that first part explains why the puppet went to him specifically in the Save Them minigame, regardless of whether or not that was intentional. If I could describe the story in one word, I'd say underutilized. That applies to pretty much everything here. Gabriel, as I mentioned earlier, the recounting of the missing children incident, the mysterious shadow that lures Timmy to Freddy's, the first and only appearance of the puppet in its full glory, Mike's commitment to protecting both children and Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, and the way that the souls are somehow guided by the performance routines are all great concepts to explore, but the story didn't do much, exploring. It's so sad that the story got scrapped, because with a little work, it could have been made into something amazing. I guarantee that fans, including myself, would have gone crazy for this one if it had expanded on even just one of the elements I listed, let alone all of them. Number 35, Haps. I didn't even give this story a chance at first. I skipped it, because I heard that the whole story was about two kids climbing around a tube maze, and that sounded incredibly boring. I was half wrong in that assumption. It was surprisingly good at building up suspense, to be honest. I wasn't expecting that. I actually found myself getting pretty invested. It's kind of like a better Clob, although there's one more story that pulls off the extended claustrophobic tunnel thing even better, which we'll get to eventually. I think it's the ending that made me rank Haps this low. It ends with the protagonists hating themselves for no reason. This is a problem that a lot of the stories have, but it felt the most jarring here because it had no build-up at all. Aiden just suddenly hates the decisions he made in his life, despite having no problem with them before, and even wishes he had tried to befriend bullies. It also has a slow start, so really it's only a little over half the story that I actually enjoyed. Fun fact, this story refers to Aiden and Jace as friends a suspicious number of times. It feels like they really didn't want us to get the wrong idea about the nature of their relationship. Number 34, The Cliffs. The best thing the story did was give us FNAF fans a new horrible insult to throw at each other, and yet nobody even uses it. Talk about wasted potential. This is another one of those good stories with a dumb ending. Robert's son Tyler goes missing, and his tag-along Freddy doll keeps saying, "Why don't you go to the cliffs?" Robert takes this as an instruction to jump off of the cliffs, which understandably makes him angry. Eventually, he almost does jump off out of guilt for letting his son disappear, but he decides that his son and dead wife would want him to keep living, so he throws the doll off the cliffs instead. It's a breath of fresh air in a franchise that has a weird tendency to glorify suicide. Now, onto the dumb ending. Tyler was actually at the cliffs the whole time because he chased a dog. Tagalong Freddy just decided to be vague for the hell of it, I guess. Also, the doll magically disappears after that. I have no idea what that's meant to signify. Number 33, Lally's Game. We've reached the halfway mark of this list, and what a good story to indicate that. Lally's Game is the most just okay of all the just okay stories. It's what some might refer to as the FNAF story of all time. The story almost did something really interesting. Throughout the story, a lot of seeds were planted for a reveal that, unlike all these other randomly appearing animatronic stories, this was a result of Cade, the protagonist's husband, having a psychotic obsession with the Lally doll. But then at the very end, we find out that Lally really was just another haunted object. I think the wasted potential is a large part of what makes this the most average story. After all, wasted potential is the franchise's middle name. I have to admit, I find Lally really funny. Unlike with all the randomly appearing animatronic stories and frights, there's no explanation for this thing being alive. His origin doesn't even make sense. He's a doll that a Pizzaplex patron would hide and then search for. But they should know where the doll is because they're the one who hid it. This is even pointed out in the story. The game couldn't have been designed to work that way, right? Surely Lally messed with something. I kinda hope he never gets explained, because that would probably ruin the humor of it. Fun fact, there's an unexplained moment in the Stitchwraith stingers that seems to reference this story, but that's impossible from a timeline standpoint. It makes me wonder if Lally's Game was originally supposed to be a fright story, but then got scrapped and retooled into a Tales one. Number 32, Fetch. This is one of those stories that I used to hate, but came to somewhat appreciate it. I'm not big on sci-fi, and there's a lot of pseudoscience shoved into here that literally never comes up again. It feels like this story is supposed to be super important, given that Andrew associates himself with this one infected object specifically, but it really isn't important at all. It's essentially the Fazbear Fright's equivalent of Tiger Rock, except in reverse, if that makes sense. I don't think it does, but I can't come up with a better way to explain it. The idea of an animatronic that takes instructions too literally in an act of malicious compliance is an interesting one, and I have to wonder if it was part of what inspired the Mimic. Although I don't like how, unlike with the Mimic, they immediately wrote off the idea of using loopholes. Greg, the protagonist, says he's tried giving Fetch an impossible task and it didn't work. But we never see this happen. I get the feeling they threw that in at the last second as an excuse. This is the first and only story to try to incorporate teen slang. I hope it stays that way. I don't know if they did this because of the focus on smartphones, or if they just felt like trying something new. But when I did recognize a slang term, like lit or Gucci, it was painful. And when I didn't recognize one, like DDAS, I got pulled out of the story and sat there wondering where they even got the idea to put that in there, and how they expected anyone to know what it means. I even tried looking it up and it wasn't in the Urban Dictionary, so I have to assume the writers made it up and just thought we'd get it. Eventually I used context clues to understand that it meant don't do anything stupid. But it's ironic because putting that in the story was doing something stupid. Alright, time to calm down. What else do I like about this story? It's good at build-up. Each task Fetch messes up gets progressively more concerning. At first it's just random helpful stuff, like ordering a candy bar. But then Fetch kills a mean dog that tried to attack Greg. It was still helpful, but way overkill, literally. Then he steals Craig's uncle's finger because they joked about it being lucky. Then he kills Craig's crush and drags her dead body into his house. Then he sends a text saying, "See you." I wonder if Fetch killed Greg after that, or if he let him be charged with murder. I wish the story had gotten just a few more pages. I was really confused when I got to the last page for the first time. It didn't feel like a cliffhanger, it just felt like they forgot to end the story. Fun fact, there appear to be some time shenanigans going on at the Freddy's location in this story. The building has less damage on the inside than it does on the outside, in a way that Greg points out should be physically impossible. Also, Fetch is said to be as old as Greg's dad, but he syncs up with smartphones. The obvious contradiction there is pointed out by the characters, but it goes completely unexplained. Number 31, The Monty Within. Fittingly, this story can be split into two halves. The first half is excruciatingly boring. It's just a thinly veiled lesson in pseudoscience. The second half, though, is hilarious. I never cared much for Monty before the story, but I love him now. It's so funny how, unlike the rest of the glam rocks, he's intentionally programmed to be a massive jerk. Having Glitchtrap follow Vanessa around in her head was a terrifying concept. Having Monty follow someone around in their head is a meme come to life in the best way. Side note, I love how nonchalant this line is, like it's a completely rational thing to be thinking about. Were the movements coordinated with Kane's brainwaves, as he suspected? And how had Fazbear synced up to his mind? Number 30, the Stitchwraith Stingers. I really liked the first half of these. Stingers 1 through 6 set up a really interesting story with a detective mystery, a previously unseen hidden victim, and the last stand of the franchise's main overarching antagonist himself. Once it got to Epilogue 7, though, it started to fall apart. It was like they forgot what they were gonna write, so they threw a bunch of random stuff in instead. The puppet shows up for a second and instantly defeats William Afton. Andrew screws off forever without accomplishing anything. Jake heals a homeless man's trauma. Eleanor disguises herself as two separate drug addicts and gets Jake to bring her to the home of a remnant scientist, and Detective Larson fights Eleanor in a dream state while Jake uses his angry boy powers to one-hit her. What happened here? There's gotta be a really interesting story behind the development of these stingers. Number 29, The Fourth Closet. I used to hate this book with a passion. I felt like it ruined not just the books that came before it, but the entire franchise. The whole concept is just so stupid in every way. Nowadays, my opinion is a lot more torn. There are some aspects I've come to appreciate, and some that I've come to hate even more now than I did back in 2018. There's a lot of interesting characterization here for William, Henry, and Elizabeth. I would have preferred that more of this showed up in the games, but I'm willing to take what I can get at this point. What gets to me the most these days is that this book is just so bafflingly mean-spirited, and I don't think it's even really intended to be that way. Charlie is told that she's just a byproduct of her father's depression and that she shouldn't exist, and almost instantly, she agrees and commits a murder-suicide in the exact same manner that her father killed himself. And then she maybe survives, and the suicide is never addressed. The book just ends there, with John and the maybe Charlie walking off into the sunset. I actually have what I believe to be a pretty strong theory as to why this book ended up the way it did. It's because it's two different stories mashed together. First, there's the original story that was hinted at way back in The Silver Eyes, where Charlie is a series of robots, and the last one got rebuilt into Foxy. Then, there's the story that Scott wasn't able to fully fit into Sister Location and Pizzeria Simulator, where William melts down the animatronics and turns them into the fun times, with Baby as his sidekick. In order to tie these two unrelated plots together, Foxy was replaced with Baby, William sent her to do the work of getting the Ella ragdoll, and we got a total disjointed mess with two separate, underwhelming conclusions. Number 28, What We Found. Here we have the most frustrating story from a theorizing standpoint. It could be giving us some major answers, but there are enough contradictions that this could just as easily be a reinterpretation of FNAF 3 with no bearing on the games whatsoever. I made a whole video about that and wasn't able to come to any conclusions at all. But forget that, I'm here to judge these stories based on quality, not theorist brownie points. Although to be honest, I've let some bias slip through on that front. Whatever. As a story, outside the context of the lore as a whole, this is a decent novella. Springtrap was just as intimidating in this story as he was in the game it's based on. Except for when he's asking math questions to the protagonist, Hudson. That was too goofy for an otherwise legitimately frightening character in my opinion. I do have 2 issues with this story, although neither of them is quite enough to be a deal breaker. First, I don't think that this was the best setting for this protagonist. Hudson has nothing to do with Freddy's, so it was weird for him to be the one given a story taking place in the building all about the horrific legacy it left behind. Springtrap is a decent enemy for him, at least, since they're both associated with fire, and William feeds on people's fear. So I feel like they could have had the story be set sometime between Five Nights at Freddy's 3 and Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, but in a place that suited Hudson better. Second, this borders on being another torture story. It's not nearly as bad as Claustrophobia, because Hudson is warned early on that he should quit the job and he doesn't listen, but the amount of trauma he was forced to relive throughout the story felt gratuitous at times. We didn't need to see every awful thing that ever happened to him in order to understand he's dealing with traumatic flashbacks. It just goes on and on and on, and it makes me start to wonder if I'm supposed to be enjoying his misery. I also don't like how the end of the story makes it sound like Hudson is getting what he deserves. Hudson heard what sounded like a sigh rushing through the oven. "Your path is your path," Granny's voice said, and the oven got hotter and hotter. Like, Jesus Christ, even when he's at his lowest, when he's literally about to die to the thing that best represents his trauma, they're still kicking this guy down. Fun fact, this is the last story to have unique artwork in the Ultimate Guide, implying that it was written in the earlier stages of the Fright series development and got pushed back for some reason. Number 27, The Twisted Ones. Ah yes, the book that I leaked in 2017. I started a whole live read leak culture when I got this one, and I really regret that. But that's neither here nor there. I just feel weirdly accomplished by the fact I made a horrible mistake. But what was I saying? Oh yeah, The Twisted Ones. The unnecessary bridge between the silver eyes and the fourth closet. I feel like everyone kinda got the feeling this one was unneeded as soon as they read it. But those suspicions were only really confirmed when the fourth closet came out and made this one feel like a prologue. I like the concept of this book. The twisted animatronics can make kids hallucinate that they look like actual living cartoon mascots, which draws the kids in closer and allows them to be kidnapped. But on the other hand, for people who already expect the animatronics to look scary, it turns them into hideous monsters. It's a really clever way of using the dichotomy of how people see these things to the story's advantage. I just didn't feel like this was the place for it. The flow of the trilogy was completely broken by the need to explore this idea that was only barely related to what was to come in the next book. Plus, even when the illusion discs come back again, they don't work the same way at all. This book makes it clear that the discs make you see what you expect to see, but the fourth closet makes them magic devices that turn things into whatever the person that put them there wants. I do think the main character was handled the best in this book, at least. Charlie has an active goal instead of moping about like in the first book, or doing literally nothing for most of the third book. Also, one little idea that was thrown in here that I wish would come back is that because the Twisted Animatronics and Spring Bonnie were linked to the same performance routine program, Springtrap was able to control them. I found that to be a better explanation than stuff like the drawings on the walls or William's sheer evilness. Oh, and I know this wasn't in any way intentional, and was actually just foreshadowing the Charlie bot twist, but Charlie always gave me trans person in denial vibes in this book. I mean, just take this little moment for example. As she dried her hands, she looked at herself in the mirror. Her reflection looked wrong somehow. Off. as if it wasn't herself she saw, but a copy, someone else dressed as her. And then there's this huge chunk of text that I won't read out, but you can pause to read it if you want to. I like how some of these stories have stuff that we can relate to even in ways that weren't intended by the authors. Number 26, The Mimic. This is the one that the game theorists pretended was about something completely different than what it was in reality. I'm still unreasonably salty about that. Ironically, given what I just said, this story is definitely geared toward theorists. There's a lot of information in here to dig through. That being said, they did put effort into making sure it was a decent story on its own. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it does what it needs to. I'd prefer a more interesting backstory for the main antagonist of this current era, but to be fair, this is only the first half of his origin story. I kinda wish they had dedicated the second half of the story to giving the other half of his origin, though, because the way it is now, it stops dead in its tracks to do the same stuff we already saw over and over in the epilogues at this point. When I went back to reread the story, I stopped once the narrative shifted from Edwin to the Searchers, because I don't care about that part. I think this was the first prequel story in the books, actually, unless you count The Man in Room 1280, but that's before all of the main stories and Frights, rather than a prequel to a single story. This one is specifically a prequel to the Storyteller. It seems like FNAF generally does a good job with prequels, what with FNAF 2, FNAF 4, and now this. I kinda like it when a narrative unfolds backwards. It's fun to know where things ended up, but have to figure out how they got there. Fun fact: nobody can agree on when the story takes place. It might be in the late 70s. It might be in 1984. It might be 40 years before the Storyteller. It might be 36 years before the Storyteller. Typical Scott math, really. Number 25, Out of Stock. This story feels more childish than any other story on this list. That's not necessarily a bad thing in regards to the story itself, but it does make it stand out like a sore thumb. It really hammers in the whole don't steal and count your blessings stuff, which are two of the cheapest morals ever in my opinion. I do think this story did a great job at adapting FNAF gameplay though, which is something that's done surprisingly rarely. Also, I appreciate that they managed to take the hyper-realistic eyes and teeth cliché and make it actually creepy. It was kind of funny to see a bunch of high schoolers fighting over a new stuffed toy. It just goes to show how insanely huge Freddy's is in this universe. Sometimes it feels like Scott tuning his own horn, and it gives me a laugh. Fun fact, this is the only FNAF story to feature a confirmed gay couple. Number 24, Dap-phobia. This was a great lore dump, but as an actual story, it was just okay. The first half is mostly a retread of the Help Wanted story, and the second half is kind of forced. Afton's whole manipulative speech at the end fell flat, because we were just told a few pages before that what he's saying is completely wrong. He says Rory's parents and friends didn't care about him, but Wade said they've been searching for him the whole time. Maybe long-term exposure to the nightmare gas broke the part of Rory's brain that made decisions? He has been mentally seven for a decade, so I guess that's not too far-fetched, but it's still annoying from a storytelling standpoint. I think a bad ending needs to be earned, and this story didn't really earn it. With that said, it was so cool seeing places from the games get adapted here, and the story played with the theme of repetition in some really clever ways. William is also at possibly his most evil here. Usually his evil deeds are done at least in part to further a goal, but here he leaves Rory in a nightmare for 10 years, despite the experiment itself lasting less than 1 year. And yes, he was intentionally left there the whole time, because the tape at the end says, "All these years you've been cared for." The natural conclusion from that information would be that he left Rory there simply because he could. Fun fact, it's actually impossible to track Rory's movements using the sister location map. There are several instances where he should have walked straight into a wall. Number 23, Room for One More. Man, this was a weird one. I I can't help but wonder if it was inspired by that old theory that the Minorinas burrowed into Mike's flesh during night 4 of Sister Location. Sometimes I think this concept is really creepy, but then I visualize it and realize how stupid it is. It's like that urban legend that if you open your mouth when you sleep, spiders will crawl in. It sounds scary to think of an insect crawling inside you, doesn't it? Now, replace the word spiders with something really silly. That's basically this story in a nutshell. Also, Funtime Foxy becomes a cab driver. Come to think of it, this was the first joke story in the franchise. Everything before this, except maybe some parts of Into the Pit, was played straight. It might sound like I've been complaining this whole time, but I do like getting these dumb stories every now and then. It's a refreshing break from all the doom and gloom. The relatively short length of the story adds to the feeling of it being a little break in between the true horror, unlike some other joke stories that drag on way longer than they need to, like, for example, The Monty Within. This is one of those rare times where the aftermath of a major event in the series gets explored. We can tell this is after the Ennard incident because only the Minorinas are left, but Circus Baby's entertainment and rental is still open. It seems like it's been converted into a factory instead of a storage facility. I also have a small theory about this story. Since ingesting Minorinas causes Stanley to have dreams about all of the fun times, but not Baby, I think this means the Minorinas have teensy tiny traces of the same remnant that was injected into the fun times. That would also explain how Stanley didn't die from blood loss the first time a Minorina crawled through his body. Fun fact, people once tried to use the name Forest Street to prove that the story takes place in Maryland, despite that being the 41st most used street name in America, with there being 3,309 streets with this name as of 1993. Number 22, Step Closer. Oh boy, it's another one of these freaking stories. Judging by how much higher this one is than Hide and Seek, I guess it's easier to look past the language when the story that's being told is actually good. FNAF has never really delved into the realm of curses before this story, and as far as I can remember, it never has again. It makes this one feel really unique. I feel like curses would be a good way to play around with the whole intention/0-point field/whatever thing that's going on. So it's strange that the idea was never used again. Maybe they figured they got as much mileage out of it as they could with this story, so they quit while they were ahead. Foxy was really cool here. I mean, he's always cool, he's Foxy, but still, the curse allows you to feel his presence the whole way through, even though he rarely physically appears, which is something a lot of other stories tried and failed to achieve. Usually when this kind of thing happens, the animatronic threat is physically stalking the character, which tends to feel silly. Why does nobody else see this very obviously out-of-place thing that follows a protagonist around? Here, though, people do see the thing that's following our protagonist Pete around, because it's just normal stuff that happens to threaten the continued safe existence of his eye and arm. Some people say the ending to this story was dumb, but I thought it was creepy. Pete keeps narrowly avoiding Foxy's attacks, so Foxy makes it so he literally can't, because he can't move. When you think about it, all he said was that Pete would lose an eye and an arm. He never said that he wouldn't also lose other things, like his life and his mobility. It's a clever loophole, and I wonder if Pete realized in hindsight that if he had given up and let his eye and arm be taken, he'd have been left alone after that. Side note, I find it funny that people still say this story was the thing to confirm Mike Bro, when the Ultimate Guide never so much as mentions the idea that this story has any connection to that theory. I mean, Mike Bro is pretty obviously true, but not because of this story. Number 21, The Breaking Wheel. This is the right way to do a gore story. The blood and guts are only present once, but they hit hard. That way it's actually impactful. The descriptions in this story don't hold back. The monster here is basically Mangle, but with human parts instead of animatronic ones. I'll just read you an excerpt, because paraphrasing won't do it justice. It looked like the bone structure of his forehead, cheeks, and jaw had been pulverized. His features were so distorted he resembled some kind of crudely sewn cloth version of himself. No longer framed by wavy blonde hair, because that hair was now sticky and stringy with congealed blood. Julius's face was like a repulsive doll's face. Blood was pooling in the spongy mass of what used to be Julius's face. It looked like a misshapen sponge that had been used to clean up a massacre, and now it was dropping its warm, wet contents onto Reed's cheeks. The previously cream-colored scarf looped around Julius's neck was saturated too. It hung down toward Reed like a dead animal in a slaughterhouse. This felt like pressure, but a lot better. The exoskeleton is similar to a Springlock suit, but not so similar that it feels like retreading old ground. And instead of going on and on about the details of how Julius's body broke, we get Reed's speculations on how the endoskeleton could potentially damage Julius, before he's forced to gaze upon the true end result. Admittedly, the story was way too drawn out, which pretty much killed the tension after a while and dragged it down quite a few places on this list. But that's better than the alternative of making the whole story be Julius dying a slow, painful death. Number 20, The Scoop. Surprisingly, this was my favorite of the scrapped stories. I heard about it from leaks, and I thought it was gonna be really stupid. Okay, well, it was really stupid, but it was still pretty good. Except for the last few pages, but they're all after the climax this time, so they're much easier to ignore. I like how the story plays into the state of the fanbase back in the early days, back when so many kids were insistent that the games were based on true events. It definitely feels like it was written specifically with 2014 and 2015 fans in mind. I wonder if this was one of the first stories to be written for the Fright series. It feels so fundamentally different from every other story, and it's the only one to take place in a world where the FNAF games really are just games, rather than being a cover-up by Fazbear Entertainment, which doesn't seem to exist at all in this story. Still, it's probably for the best that this one was scrapped. It leaves a lot of holes, like how this universe's Scott Cawthon just so happened to create a game so closely tied to a real event, and also accurately predicted where Stevie Robbins' body was. Plus, if someone reads a story that explicitly tells us not to look for a real-world ARG, and thinks that it's hinting at a real-world ARG, you know you've messed up big time. Number 19, Blackbird. This was a really creative story, especially for how early it was. I think this was the first story where they experimented with stuff that was really only tangentially related to FNAF. Unless you count Bunny Call, but that one is kinda in a weird gray area where we don't really know if Fazbear Entertainment had any involvement. It's cool to see how the rules of the universe affect people in places that have nothing to do with Freddy's. At least, that's how I felt before the Stitchwraith stingers implied that simply uttering the name Freddy Fazbear was enough to summon Eleanor to try to ruin Noel's life. I wish they hadn't retroactively tied it to her like that. But I guess that's an issue with the stingers rather than an issue with Blackbird, so I'll give it a pass for this review. It's a shame this one didn't get a graphic novel adaptation. I think Blackbird would have been so cool if he was portrayed visually, especially since he was created to be a character in a short film in universe. The ending was a bit anticlimactic, with the Blackbird simply giving up after Noel apologizes to some random kid he bullied in the past. But the stakes never felt too high to begin with in this story, so I guess that's not too big of a problem. Fun fact, this story started a strange trend where a character with the same name as one from an earlier story would say the name of the story the first one came from. Here, a girl named Amber says "Room for One More," and there was a character named Amber in the story Room for One More. And then later, in Frailty, a character named Jeremiah says, "I hope you find your prankster," and the protagonist of the story Prankster was named Jeremiah. I'm sure there are more examples of this, but these are the only two that I remember. Number 18, Bunny Call. This is the most FNAF-ish story to not include any FNAF characters or locations. It kinda feels like a fan game in story form in the latter half, with the protagonist, Bob, fending off a murderous costumed character by closing doors and windows until 6 a.m. It was a cool way of incorporating gameplay elements in a way that wasn't simply retelling a game we've already played. Bob is a breath of fresh air in this franchise. He's an actual good, non-negligent dad who plays an active role in the story. That's incredibly rare in Five Nights at Freddy's. Admittedly, he pulls a jerk move with the bunny call, but he's given understandable reasons for doing so, and he decides to undo it anyway. Ralpho is a surprisingly scary antagonist. He starts out as just a little creepy, but once you get to the part where he starts to bleed but doesn't stop his attack, you realize that this is a genuine threat. And the reveal at the very end that there was never anyone in the suit? Creepy stuff. Fun fact, because the artist was never given a proper description, the cover art for the story shows Ralpho as something completely different from what he really is. Number 17, The Silver Eyes. Finally, we've made it to the very first Five Nights at Freddy's book ever. There are actually 2 versions of this one, but they're almost exactly the same, so there's no need to count them separately. I was so excited for this book when it was announced. Five Nights at Freddy's, The Untold Story? Finally, all our questions will be answered! Needless to say, I was let down when it finally released. There were a few fantastic snippets, like when Sammy was kidnapped and when William explained how the spring locks work, but the majority of the story was kinda boring. It was surprisingly rare for anything to actually happen. This also came just 5 months after the most confusing game in the franchise, and it had a cover that felt like an obvious reference to said game. But then there was nothing about that game in here, aside from an appearance from Fredbear. In hindsight, though, there were quite a few answers in this book. They just aren't the ones I cared about at the time. We got confirmation that Fredbear was Golden Freddy and that Spring Bonnie was from the first location. We got an identity for the killer and the owner of Freddy's. And we got an explanation for why Foxy was always so twitchy. This book honestly could have fit into the game universe if it hadn't ended with Charlie causing William to get spring-locked. Ultimately, I can't bring myself to put this book any lower on the list, because it introduced so much stuff that we take for granted today. Without this book, we wouldn't have Henry or William, 2 of the most important characters in the overarching story. Okay, well, we would have had William, but he would have still been the nameless, motiveless purple guy. And this book had my favorite depiction of the character, so it would have been a shame not to get that. I love how he's the perfect combination of pathetic and truly threatening. Fun fact, it's likely that the reason Scott chose to have this book take place in Hurricane, Utah, is because the first mainstream Freddy's is Real hoax originated from that town. And yes, I did steal this fun fact from Twitter. Number 16, The Storyteller. This story uses such an obvious idea for protagonists that I'm amazed it took 50 novellas to get them. Ever since Help Wanted the game came out in 2019, people have wanted to know who's in charge of Fazbear Entertainment. In this story, we finally get our answer, and it makes so much sense. It's a board of directors that has no idea what they're doing, and the only 2 who have even the slightest idea of what's going on whatsoever die by the end. It's no wonder Glitchtrap and Vanny can do whatever they want with no opposition. Edwin is a great protagonist, and I wish he hadn't died so we could get more of him. He's the actual voice of reason that Henry was intended to be, and he has these awful flashbacks that complement the theme of the past repeating itself. Mr. Burrows is an idiot and a monster, and I love him for it. He's the kind of guy who's too stupid to realize he's making a mistake, but also too stubborn for anyone to explain to him why it's a mistake. He dies in the very trap he set at the end, which is such fantastic karmic justice. I think that was my favorite part of the story. The only bad thing I can say about this story is that it desperately needed another look from an editor. There are a bunch of obvious typos that anyone would have caught if they did more than skim through, and a really noticeable timeline error that caused people to think the Pizzaplex opened in 2014, nearly a decade before Pizzeria Simulator. It also has yellow Glamrock Chica for some reason, and her personality is completely different. I can't really tell if that's an intentional in-universe thing that used to exist, or if it's just some kind of old concept or misunderstanding with the authors. Fun fact, this story features a building called the Fazbear Entertainment Archives, which is referenced in both the Ultimate Guide and Freddy and Friends on Tour. This place is said to have records of every project the company has ever worked on, which makes me wonder why Henry didn't burn it down. Number 15, Into the Pit. This was the first story in the Fazbear Fright series, and it did a good job setting the tone. Say what you want about the series, but it told you straight off the bat what you were getting yourself into when it gave you a story about a ball pit that allows people to seemingly travel back in time. And sure, it's technically not time travel, but that's semantics in regards to the story on its own. For how crazy this one gets, I have surprisingly little to say about it. It's strange, it's fun, and it was a good pick to make a game about. Fun fact, despite the missing children incident taking place in June of 1985, Mike's favorite movie is said to be Back to the Future, which didn't release until July of 1985. Number 14, Bobby Dots Part 1. When this story's description dropped, I thought it was going to be another insanely stupid leap in Fazbear Entertainment's quest for world domination. When I actually read it, though, I was surprised to discover that it was not only logical within the existing story, but also a ton of fun. The Bobby Dots are great, and it's a shame they probably won't ever return. They were like Helpy except better, because they each had their own personalities that would clash with each other at times. And even though I didn't like the answers that came later, the build-up of the mystery was pretty exciting here. I've seen a lot of stories in recent years trying to do the evil digital home assistant thing, but none did it as well as this. The Bobby Dots are so much more than a Siri or an Alexa. They're like actual roommates. Sure, it's not practical, but they get around that issue by making it known that these are defective Bobby Dots rather than this being the norm. Fun fact, in an earlier version of this story, Rose was said to have, quote, an abundantly noticeable bust, but it was cut for the final release. I, for one, find this change to be deeply insulting. I worked so hard for my abundantly noticeable bust, and they're tossing theirs away willy-nilly? Forget everything I said. Bottom of the list. Number 13, GGY. There's this claim amongst the community that says that the Five Nights at Freddy's books are filled with the lore that was supposed to go into the games but got removed. This is the one time where I believe that statement to be actually true. There are plenty of others that are clearly connected to the games, but none feel like they were retroactively pulled out of a game for the sake of being in a book instead. In fact, we pretty much know this to be the case, because there's a scrapped line in Security Breach that was going to address Gregory's past.
Gregory, I know why you are not in the customer database. I remember you from the...
But despite knowing that, this story really got me hooked. I didn't care about Gregory or Glamrock Freddy before this story, but now I want to know what their whole deal is. I love how it recontextualized Security Breach to be about these three beings that all got brainwashed into killing people, with the two main ones not even remembering that it happened and that their current dynamic stems from their time as killers. And even as a standalone story, it's still pretty good. It's a cool little middle school detective story with a surprisingly dark ending. Number 12, Find Player 2. Sorry, I mean, Find Player 2! I feel like this one will surprise a lot of people. Yes, it's a horrible finale for the Fazbear Fright series, but that doesn't mean it's a bad story in general. The very concept of the hide-and-seek maze gives me the chills. A hidden, cramped tunnel with loud, looping jungle music that you can't escape until someone finds you? Forget what I said about Haps. This is Clythophobia done right. I've heard a lot of people hate on the protagonist, Amy, because she ditched her annoying friend. I think that's kinda dumb. She was like 10. And then there are people who think she's a jerk because she wants answers regarding said friend's disappearance, because her search for answers is selfish. Yeah, so? Mary Jo isn't coming back either way, so what's wrong with a selfish search for closure? I think the fact that I actually liked Amy is what made the twist at the end so much more effective for me than it seemingly was for most people. Imagine if your friend went missing for 10 years after a game of hide-and-seek, and then you find out that the entire time, they were right where you left them. That's gotta set a record for the longest and most disturbing hide-and-seek game of all time. I do have one lingering question. Why was the hide-and-seek maze hidden in the first place? Was this not the first time someone died in there, and Fazbear Entertainment lazily removed the signs for the place without actually destroying it? Knowing them, probably. But a theory I really like is that it fell under the no rooms without cameras rule that got the safe rooms boarded up. So they hid it away instead of going to the trouble of expanding the security system to include the maze. Number 11. Frailty. This was a cool bridge between the Frights and Tales books. It was nice to get a story showing that the events of Frights are still having effects after the series ended. And having one of Eleanor's victims survive was a fun spin on To Be Beautiful, a spiritual sequel of sorts. It also felt like an inversion of The Man in Room 1280, which is where all this began. William and Andrew clung to life in a hospital, fueling Eleanor in the process. But Jessica gave her life away in a hospital, erasing the one item of Eleanor's that was left. Also, it finally used the fact that Remnant can heal people as a meaningful and central plot point. Every other time Remnant heals someone, it's brushed aside and the ramifications don't get explored in the slightest. Not here, though. It was so fascinating to see how Jessica was able to heal others at the expense of her own life force. I'm not sure how to feel about Jessica as a character, though. I think I'd like her better if I knew why she was so remorseful, beyond the fact that she wished to be lovely and got scammed by Eleanor. As it stands, I have no idea whether she really did anything worth feeling bad about, because Five Nights at Freddy's characters constantly blame themselves for dumb things that really aren't their fault. Still, even with that issue, her story was heartbreaking, and I hope it comes back in one form or another. Maybe one of the people she gave her remnant to will come back into the picture or something. But that's wishful thinking. Get it? Wishful thinking. Because of Eleanor, and how she grants wishes, and how Jessica wished to be lovely, and
I can't do this! Not again!
Number 10. 1:35 a.m. This is a really messed up story, even by Fazbear Fright standards. It's so true to real-life mental disorders that if it weren't for Eleanor claiming responsibility in the epilogues, I'd question whether anything truly supernatural even happened here. A lot of stories aim for that, like Lally's Game, Blackbird, Dance With Me, Friendly Face, and a bunch of others that I don't feel like listing. But this is the only one that succeeds. Maybe that's partially because it's the first one, but I think it's also because of its own merit. None of the fear here is actually caused by the Ella doll. It just shows up. There's nothing scary about that in this story, just like the other stories I listed. It's the trauma that her appearance reawakens that's scary. Maybe I'm way off base here, but this story feels kinda like a metaphor for an abusive cycle to me. Delilah sees the Ella doll like a daughter at first, but once it doesn't work, she throws it out. When it comes back and she realizes she can't just get rid of it, she's petrified. All she wants to do is get away from this thing, because it reminds her of her own time as a child who was repeatedly sent from one abusive foster home to another. And then in the end, she kills herself to get away from the burden of having to be around said reminder. There's so much to unpack there. Every now and then my mind comes back to the story and just ruminates on it. Not many pieces of media have been able to do that to me. So in my eyes, that's a huge accomplishment. Fun fact, there's a theory that the title of this story is in reference to Charlie's birthday, which is the 13th of May, which is also the day I'm posting this video, which is in fact not a coincidence. I feel like if this was intentional for the story, they would have made it 5:13 a.m. to match the American calendar system. But hey, maybe the middle of the night worked better for the story than early in the morning. Number 9. The New Kid. I didn't like this one that much the first time I read it, but it really grew on me after a while. Having the protagonist be scarier than the villain is certainly an interesting spin on things. And Devin is such an interesting character. I guarantee this guy would have grown up to become a serial killer if he hadn't, died. He's so obsessive and vindictive, but it's still easy to see where he's coming from. He's usually somewhat sympathetic, but his actions are never justifiable. Kelsey is pretty interesting too, and I find myself wondering what his deal is. He and Devin kind of feel like two sides of the same coin, with both of them having the same twisted view on the concept of justice that basically amounts to an eye for an eye. Oh, and my all-time favorite depiction of a springlock failure can be found here. It's so unsettling yet so cool at the same time. When he threw both arms straight out to his sides, an ear-stabbing metallic clap resounded off all four walls around them. The clap was followed by a fingernails on a blackboard scraping sound. As abruptly as it started, the scraping sound ended with a loud slap. This triggered a cascade of snapping sounds, like dozens of steel animal traps springing into place, one right after the other. Kelsey started shrieking with the first snap. And the sound wasn't the bad part. It was bad, yes. But the bad part, the really, really bad part, was the way the suit started jerking in a spastic, horrific dance. It looked like the moth-eaten, mildew-blotched gold bear was convulsing. But it wasn't the bear. Devin knew it wasn't the bear. It was Kelsey. Sadly, I had to knock the new kid down a few places from where I originally had it, because of the nonsensical plot twist at the end. It turns out Kelsey is alive, and the whole thing was an elaborate evil plot to get Devin killed? What? Why? What was the point of that? Is Kelsey secretly Eleanor? Does he have a vendetta against loners because he thinks they're gonna grow up into serial killers like William? Is he Andrew? Was that Andrew's body in the suit? None of these questions were ever answered, and they don't add to the horror in any way, so why were they raised in the first place? Fun fact, this story contains a possible reference to the red lake that keeps reappearing in the games. The blood saturated the bear's matted fur in seconds and began pooling on the floor. It had formed an amoeba-like puddle that seemed to be crawling away from the now saturated bear suit. Devin stared at the moving blood. It looked like it was a living thing. A thinking red liquid lake stretching out, seeking. Number 8. Sergio's Lucky Day. This story is only so high because I find it hysterical. Balloon Boy drives a man insane with the power of positive thinking. Did we really need this? Yes. Yes, we did. It's great. 10 out of 10. Nothing more needs to be said. Fun fact, the story has a continuity error where smartphones existed in 1995. Number 7. Submechanophobia. This was a really nice change of pace in the Tales from the Pizzaplex series. After so many stories about futuristic, heavy sci-fi threats, the franchise finally went back to its roots, with a story about haunted animatronics in an old run-down establishment. The underwater theme was just enough of a subversion to make it feel original, rather than feeling like they ran out of ideas and went to copy off of the early games. The animatronics were all especially creative here, and I loved the little reference they threw into sea bonnies. I do wonder why they branded this water park as a Freddy's location, though. Why not go with Foxy, who's already associated with water? The story's mystery, although simple, was pretty neat too. I kinda saw the answer coming, but oh well, it's a novella. There isn't room for too many suspects. The ending was pretty funny. I love how when Roy, the security guard, buys the water park, he thinks he's important enough to replace Freddy Fazbear himself in the name of the place. It's also funny how they had to throw in a single mention of the Pizzaplex in order for this to fit in the Tales series. It does feel more like a Fright-style story after all, so I guess it makes sense that they did that. Fun fact, or rather fun opinion, I have a suspicion that this is actually a heavily edited new draft of Felix the Shark, which was scrapped in the Fright series. It's got the underwater theme, the protagonist trying to solve a mystery about the place, an ending where someone drowns because of the animatronics, and even another shark animatronic. If that is what happened, I appreciate it, because I always felt that there was good stuff in all 3 of those scrapped stories that can easily be reused to make something better. Number 6. Count the Ways. If you hate goths, then you're gonna have a bad time with the story. The main protagonist is an incredibly generic, surface-level teen goth girl. I was able to look past it, obviously, given that we're on number 6 of this entire list, but I know not everyone can do the same. What makes this story so good is the antagonist, Funtime Freddy. He's not exactly the Funtime Freddy we're used to. This version of the character is far more aware, and he uses that awareness to create the most sadistic scenarios and darkest jokes imaginable. He's so joyous and flippant about the idea of death, which makes him the perfect foil to Millie, the goth girl who romanticizes death throughout the earlier bits of the story. Despite teaching the protagonist a lesson in a screwed-up way like a lot of other antagonists, Funtime Freddy doesn't come across as preachy in this story, and that's because of one small snippet of conversation that I'm eternally grateful they added. "But why are those crimes I have to die for?" Millie asked. "Those are crimes that everybody's guilty of from time to time." The voice didn't answer, and Millie felt a small tingle of hope. Maybe she wouldn't have to take her chances by curling up on the floor of the cavity. Maybe she could talk herself out of this yet.
"Because,"
the voice said,
"you're the one who crawled into my belly."
Funtime Freddy's whole philosophy is shattered right here, but he legitimately doesn't care. He just pushes onward anyway. Regardless of whether he can defend his decision to murder Millie, he still does it simply because he's given the opportunity. This gave me such a horrible sinking feeling in my stomach, especially with the way he treated Millie almost like he viewed her as a friend in the story, albeit in a really twisted, threatening, and kidnappy way. He's an easy person, or animatronic, to get Stockholm Syndrome from. I also enjoyed the open ending in this story. It's pretty obvious that Millie dies, but the fact that we never see it leaves us with a lack of closure, making it harder to move on from how chilling of an end she had. Fun fact, this story gives Funtime Freddy a different voice from the original that we know and love. While the regular Funtime Freddy speaks in a high-pitched shriek, this one is said to have a
deep, booming voice.
Number 5, Lonely Freddy. This is another controversial one. A lot of people really hate this story, and I can understand why. I think the biggest reason this one ranks so high for me is because of how relatable it is. I have an older brother who's exactly like Alec. They even have the same birthday. So where most people would probably see Alec as an annoyance, I can understand exactly where he's coming from, and I even find myself feeling bad for him. Aside from that, I liked how most of the story took a breather from the horror to show us the normal experience most kids have with Freddy's. It's not often that we get a long look at how these places are supposed to be before everything falls apart. However, that does come at the expense of the ending being way too abrupt. It felt like the horror twist was only added out of obligation, which is strange since the next 2 stories we're going to talk about weren't afraid to skimp completely on the horror. Number 4, Alone Together. This is my favorite of all the Tales from the Pizzaplex stories, which is ironic since it barely features the Pizzaplex. A lot of these stories try to add in a plot twist at the end, but this story did that by far the best. It's actually woven into the whole story and recontextualizes the whole thing in a way that adds to it instead of raising unnecessary questions or detracting from the point. It even managed to add in a lot of world building regarding ghosts, potentially helping us answer some major questions about other spirits in the franchise. I felt bad for Travis, who didn't even know he was dead and just thought no one wanted to interact with him. But I felt terrible for his dad. He loses his son, then his wife leaves him, and all he can do to cope is pretend like his son is still there and call his ex-wife on the phone out of desperation. Also, can we talk about how evil the school is in this story? They clearly covered up Travis's death. He went missing, and his school project that was designed for a person to hide inside was sitting in a classroom, and said project ended up getting locked away in a hidden shed. It doesn't take a genius to figure out what happened there. Lastly, let's talk about the main Freddy's element in this story, Son, or as he's called here, Son Man. At first I thought that he felt really tacked on. He could have been anyone, so it felt more like a way to be able to say, This is technically a Pizzaplex story, then a meaningful decision. But then I remembered that they make a point in the story of how Travis can't go to the Pizzaplex because he has no friends, because he's a ghost. And so making a recreation of his favorite character is the closest thing he can get to feeling a connection with his peers. Plus, the actual daycare attendant looks to be wooden, so he's a pretty good pick for the Mechanical Turk. Number 3, The Real Jake. Now that we're at the top 3, we finally made it to the stories that I would genuinely consider masterpieces. What this story lacks in horror, it more than makes up for in feels. This is the last thing I expected from a Five Nights at Freddy's book, and unlike the other times I've said that, I couldn't be happier about it. It goes out of its way to be as heart-wrenching as possible in every way, and yet it never feels forced. Every new painful event feels like a natural, inevitable step from what happened before. Everything in this story is so painfully human. There's such a desperation to rationalize an indescribably horrible problem that's inflicted onto children with no way to prevent or cure it, and yet naturally, horrifically, the story comes to a close with these rationalizations being abysmal failures. While Jake, the 9-year-old boy dying of cancer, is framed as the main character of this story, I'd say the true protagonist is his caretaker, Margie. She tries to hold on to the belief that Jake will beat the odds and pull through, but once Jake's dad, who she fell in love with, dies overseas in the military, her desperate optimism snaps. The saddest part of the entire story for me was when she tries and fails to tell Jake that his dad died, and she realizes Jake himself is on the verge of death, so she takes a pair of scissors, and she cuts up all of her signature smiley face shirts that she wears as a reminder to stay positive before she calls to get Jake taken to hospice. What makes this whole thing even sadder is that the Stitchwraith never meets Margie, so she never knows that he ended up getting a semi-happy ending. She becomes a lonely cat lady after the events of the story, and at that point it feels like she herself is barely clinging to life. Fun fact, the way that the universe operates in Five Nights at Freddy's, particularly in the Fazbear Fright series, is based around the theories of snake oil saleswoman Lynn McTaggart, and despite a lot of ideas being inspired by her works, this story completely spits in the face of her idea that you don't need a doctor because positive intention can heal all ailments, including, and I'm not making this up, advanced cancer. I feel like this was a smart way of borrowing ideas from a problematic person without endorsing them. Number 2, The Man in Room 1280. I feel a little guilty for not putting this in the number 1 spot. Objectively, it's the most well-written story in the franchise. The protagonist is a perfect fit for the story, and for the Fazbear Fright series in general. The whole theme of the first 5 books is that agony is the strongest emotion, and Father Blythe is a man who believes that there's good in everything, and that everything will end up alright in the end. And then the very last line of the story wraps up his arc and encapsulates the message of the first half of Frights perfectly. Actually, no. I don't think everything is okay, Arthur said. For the first time in his life, he was sure of it. And throughout the story, we're bombarded with one cool, creepy sequence after another, each one expertly building up the tension until the literal explosion of a climax. And who could forget, this story took such a nice approach to expanding on the games. It gives a lot of neat context behind Ultimate Custom Night, but you don't need it in order to understand the overarching story of the games in general. There's a fight between whether the books should be irrelevant or should explain the story, but this one's the best of both worlds. Number 1, The Talbert Files. I don't know why people say they're glad this was scrapped. This would have been so much better than what we got. Michael actually does something, Shatter Victim is relevant, Cassidy is both Golden Freddy and the puppet somehow. Number 1, Coming Home. This one is exactly what I've always wanted out of a Five Nights at Freddy's story. Despite the franchise having so many child victims, it almost never explores the impact these deaths have on the victims' families, unless your name is Henry Emily. The only other time it happened is in the Silver Eyes, and that was only in one chapter. Ever since the second game, the franchise has pushed the once main characters aside for the sake of expanding on their killer, which has always rubbed me the wrong way. It's so nice to see the focus shifted back, even if it's only for a little bit. This story perfectly balances tragedy with hopefulness, showing us that at least one character affected by the missing children incident was able to find some peace without doing anything to downplay how awful the incident really was. And my god, do I adore all the characters in this story. Except the dad, but I'm not supposed to like him. Susie and Samantha's dynamic is precious. And the mom is trying so hard, and even if she's not perfect, I still love her so much. The pacing here is also perfect, although many would disagree with me on that. The story knows exactly when to seed out hints for something, and when to give the reveal. Like Susie's death, the fight about the doll, and the existence of the secret room. I like how this story is so good that a lot of people don't even care that it contradicts the games. In fact, I'm actually glad it does so. This is the perfect example of why some things need to exist in a vacuum. If it tried to bend over backwards to fit in the dog or the 30-year period where Susie's soul was bound to Chica, it would instantly fall apart. Instead, it takes one tiny slice of existing lore and builds it into its own little masterpiece. I've gone back and reread this story over and over again. It's my favorite thing in the entire franchise, and it's genuinely my favorite book, not just in Five Nights at Freddy's, but in general. If you haven't read it yet, then I implore you to do so as soon as possible. This is the peak of the franchise. And if you say otherwise, you're wrong, and I will not listen to any objections. Fun fact, this story features the exact same continuity error as The Silver Eyes, where the protagonist ages 5 years in a 3-year time span. There are so many stories that I've probably forgotten at least one. If I did, let me know and I'll leave a little review in the comments, as well as where I would have placed it in the ranking. And if you disagreed with any or all of my choices, make sure to let me know. I'd love to hear everyone else's thoughts on these stories.